This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Granger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, another one of those great Young Voices contributors we'd love to have on. Going to get a little bit of a wider perspective on a couple different things in culture and politics. Exciting to have him. He's from the south side of Chicago originally. He currently finds himself in the D.C. area. Going to be doing some more learning down there in Northern Virginia. Corey Walker, how are you, my friend? Thank you for your time today.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thrilled to have you. Let's just start there. You're in the nation's capital. You are an observer of culture and politics. I'm doing this from the national narratives and from what I can gather, but you're in D.C. We're hearing a lot of talk about President Biden, of course, his performance in Ukraine. We just got new polling numbers on his domestic performance. And as we all suspect, the economy is the hot button issues: inflation, gas prices, food prices, these sorts of things. You're in the nation's capital. What's the perception of President Biden's leadership right now, both the current crisis and kind of the background crisis that normal Americans are paying a little bit more attention to than maybe the media is, those kitchen table issues like inflation, like gas prices? What's the feel there on the ground right now?
Well, I would say that from within DC, I mean, DC in and of itself is kind of like an echo chamber, right? So it's kind of difficult to get a sense of what the nation is thinking, largely because of the fact that, you know, people who live in DC are in a bubble, right? And let's be real here. I mean, if people in DC actually did have a good sense or good instinct of what Americans at large thought, I think their priorities and the policies they push forward would look pretty different than what they actually are. I think that most people in DC, when they think of the way Biden is performing, there's a lot of disappointment, right? On all ends, right? If you're a conservative or a liberal. But I mean, for a lot of people, like there are people who wanted voting rights reform, obviously, but that wasn't the most important thing on their agenda, in my opinion, and many people's opinion. And many of my friends who work within DC, who work on Capitol Hill, have been really frustrated with the lack of focus by the Biden administration in regards to being able to really narrow in on the issues that most Americans care about, which is the economy, the inflation, jobs, crime, which is, you know, a huge, massive issue that Democrats keep trying to play down, and COVID, right? I mean, Biden was elected to bring normalcy back to our country after President Trump, which love him or hate him. He definitely wasn't a normal president, right? So I think that Biden has been a really huge disappointment. There's a lot of hope, I think, with liberal Democrats that he'll be able to, you know, improve his numbers eventually if COVID ever goes down, which I'm not sure if it ever will recede or go back to normal. But there's hope that, you know, if they can get a handle on COVID, eventually get a handle on the economy, that Biden's numbers will improve. But it's difficult. You know, I mean, gas prices are really high. I was at the grocery store the other day. I literally they were rationing meat. I couldn't buy as much meat as I wanted to because I wanted to throw a barbecue. So I had to can only buy 2 packs of chicken instead of buying 4 packs of chicken. They put on the grill. I think those little things that Americans see every day that are causing their lives to be more difficult are really contributing to why his poll numbers are so unimpressive. And I think a lot of people in DC see that, you know, I mean, when times are bad, the president gets all the blame, and times are not really good for most Americans right now.
Yeah, I think you hit on an important point talking to Corey Walker, Young Voices. There's certain things that just burn through. And like, even though we had, the State of the Union speech, which the president did pretty well at, because he usually does well at set piece things, we'll call it that. The Ukraine stuff, there hadn't been a major misstep there. He's been in line with our allies. Normally, those would be things he would be getting some kind of a bump out of. Yeah. I think you're making a good point of, it's not that he's really doing anything, horrifically wrong other than just being Joe Biden and the things that come with Joe Biden that are baked into the cake at this stage of his game. I just don't think you're going to have any smart one-liner or any clever slogan or any kind of a big policy initiative that overrides things like gas prices and inflation, because those are just so ever present in people's faces right now. Like you said, you went to just do a barbecue and there's food and somebody's going to get blamed for that. Not you personally, but when people do that, when you're in the big chair, you get the good and the bad. And this is one of those things that it's not all President Biden's fault. It's a lot of different factors. Those are lagging indicators we talk about all the time. But when you're when you're in the chair, you get the blame, and prices are up, he's going to get the blame.
And I think part of it is just the fact that Biden himself has been pushed so much by the progressive left-wing flank of the Democratic Party to embrace a lot of these policies that just naturally are going to drive up gas prices, right? Like when you are so opposed to fracking and oil extraction, and when you're so opposed to energy independence, a lot of this stuff makes it much more difficult for you to be able to, keep those prices at a level that most Americans think is reasonable, right? Because these resources are scarce, and when you're restricting supply, of course, prices are going to go up. That's just basic economics. We don't live in a magical world where like oil just comes out of thin air. I mean, that stuff has to be extracted from somewhere. So there's always going to be trade-offs. And I think the Biden administration has done a lot of pandering to progressives on a lot of these issues and hoping that would pay off, but it hasn't paid off for them in poll numbers. It's not being approved by the American public. I think the ironic thing is, in the abstract, a lot of Americans do like these things, these ideas of environmentalism. But however, when you look at it in, how it actually impacts people when these policies are enacted, I think that's where the discrepancy lies, because, who doesn't want to live in a world where, all power comes from solar and wind? But the reality is that there's a transition cost, and also it's just not as effective. So the buck stops somewhere. And I think for most Americans, they don't like having to live with the pain of having to spend more money and feeling like they're poorer. Like, no one wants that. And I think Biden is paying a significant price for that. And even if you don't like President Trump, I think most Americans, if they're being honest, would say that their personal lives individually were better off under Trump, even if you don't like Trump as a human being, which I think a lot of people find themselves in that position right now.
Has the environment changed? Not the environment like we're talking about energy, but the media environment, the political environment. Has that changed as well? Because I know you've been writing about energy and specifically things like fracking, oil extraction, natural gas extraction. Mm-hmm. I think the environment of how people understand these things has changed a little bit, because let's just back up for a second. We've had 2+ years of COVID, where I think people got an education on how supply chain works that they probably didn't previously have, the worldwide globalized supply chain. So they understand better now than they did maybe 3 or 4 years ago that world events affect the supply chain. So now on the heels of that, we have Ukraine and we have Russia, and they know that that's a gas-driven issue. I think people's literacy on this topic has just gone up to where they naturally know it's like, oh, war in Europe, Russia's a major energy importer, energy prices are going up. I think we may just have a better educated and a better technology environment where people can bifurcate these things a little bit and go, okay, this one part of this isn't President Biden's fault, but this part still is President Biden's fault. And I don't think maybe the media is giving credit that we have this couple of years of education on how global supply chains affect folks, and they understand it better now than maybe they did prior.
But do you think the average American really is thinking that deeply about this in terms of they understand how global supply chain works and how all these complex geopolitical issues actually impact a global supply chain? I'm kind of cynical about that sort of thing. You're right that we have more information. We have the worldwide internet at our fingertips, and we have more information at our disposal than ever before. But that doesn't necessarily mean that people are more well informed, because misinformation is also out there. And particularly on the right, the GOP is very good at weaponizing this sort of this sort of landscape in which things are going pretty poorly, and they're really good at laying blame at the president's feet. They're really good at that, much better than Democrats ever were. So I'm not so exactly sure. I mean, there's a lot of things people will blame the president for that, in my opinion, just doesn't make any sense. He's also made some sacrifices, which, for example, like not choosing to import oil from Russia, which may be morally correct, but then you also have to weigh that out with electoral concerns. And, and look, I mean, we also know for a fact that Germany is still importing oil from Russia. And a lot of European countries are still buying Russian oil. So to me, I think that, Biden in a lot of ways has to figure out, like what exactly he wants, because his administration's all over the place, but he's trying to walk this weird line between being progressive and being a moderate. It's just very difficult to do that. And I think that is at the crux of his issues. I mean, maybe the American public is more well-informed, like you say, but I could say on my personal end, like I'm just a very cynical person when it comes to that. And I think most people just care about your bread and butter issues of, can they afford their lives? Are they better off now than they were, before the president was elected? And since that's the answer to that question is no, for most people's lives are not better off. I think that's why he's struggling so much.
Yeah, fair enough. I was trying to be optimistic and you pulled me back into cynicism. So fine.
I'm so sorry about that.
No, but yet the reason I bring that up is because you have something stupid like the toilet paper thing. And everybody panicked. And then after about 4 or 5 days, everybody went, well, wait a minute, this is stupid. We're doing this to ourselves. And they don't remember that consistently, but we can rise to the occasion from time to time. And I'm just hoping that maybe we can do that here a little bit. To your further point, though, I think you're absolutely right. I think it is these kitchen table issues that are hurting the president right now. And I think they're hurting him because the reality, part of the reason we say it's not some of this isn't all his fault. The flip side of that is there's a lot of this he can't really do a whole lot about either.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's a lot Biden has been deeply unfortunate, right, in the hand that he has drawn. He drew the hand of having a pandemic, which is, not great, but at the same time, Trump also went through the same thing because the pandemic had occurred when Trump was in office. I think part of the problem is, even though he can't control some of these things, like he did run on this idea or this messaging that I'm a competent adult and I have all this experience, and we need an experienced adult to get us out of the pandemic and get us back to normalcy and bring back decency into our country. And like I've said before, we just don't have that. We have lived through multiple waves of COVID, which are not his fault, right? Let's be clear, it's not his fault. But with that said, the constant virtue signaling around COVID in terms of continuing mask mandates, when, California has had as many COVID cases per capita as a state like Florida, which has no restrictions whatsoever, it just doesn't make sense to me. And quite frankly, it feels a lot like Democrats are virtue signaling towards their base at the expense of, for example, kids being able to go to school and breathe freely and get a quality education. You're going to have them be remote schooled. And that's part of the reason why Democrats are facing a bloodbath across the country. Not just Biden personally, but this is affecting Democrats everywhere. I am in DC. Right south of me is Virginia, and they have a new governor right now, Glenn Youngkin, largely because of school closures, which was a huge thing. I know critical race theory was made a big ballyhoo in the media, but school closures was the biggest reason why Glenn Youngkin won his race. And like I said, it's a bread and butter issue. When you're keeping kids out of schools, when you're forcing them to wear masks that they don't need to wear, when you're forcing them to be virtual because of COVID and stuff like that, parents get mad, and so they demand change. I do think that for Biden himself, it's going to be really difficult because the Democratic base has become increasingly radicalized and polarized, much like the Republican base as well has become that. Both sides are this way. I don't want to just seem like I'm just bashing Democrats. Republicans become radicalized as well. But I think that once you have to go so far in the extreme of trying to pander to your base, which is disproportionately located in urban areas, which have less electoral power, that makes him a much more vulnerable candidate in a national election. So Joe Biden's strength was that he was relatively strong for, at least for a Democrat, with particularly white rural voters and white male rural voters. If that erodes, it's going to be difficult to see him winning re-election. And so I think even though a lot of these things are not particularly his fault directly, I do think some of his policies, at least some of the way they reacted to the circumstances around them, have simply just made it worse.
We're back with Corey Walker. Great conversation. Let me throw it to you this way, because we were talking about President Biden. I forget who did this on the internet. A couple of different people have pointed it out, but I think there's some truth to it. And you tell me what you think. But they have said that the problem with the Democratic Party right now is they need candidates under 70, but they need staffers that are over 40. That there's definitely a generational problem going on, because, like with Joe Biden, to be fair to him, he has to staff his White House with what he's got from the party. Right. And that means you're going to get a lot of 20, 30, under 40 out of college, the grunt level staffers, all due respect, but that's what those jobs are. Those are going to skew more and more progressive, probably far more progressive than he really means to be. He's always been kind of a middle of the line liberal Democrat. Yeah. I don't know how you solve that problem in the Democratic Party for right now, because I think there's just this little bit of a generational change. We saw it with the Bernie Sanders stuff a little bit. We see it with the squad, where you have a louder and louder progressive base, but they don't have the constituency to take over the party yet. Thus, you get President Biden, who did have the constituency to bring everybody together. But after Biden, I don't really see the bridge gap before they become ascendant to the whole party. There's a gap there, and I think that might be where some of that tension you're talking about with the progressive policies, I think that's where some of that's coming, and I think that's built into the party. I don't know that that's really a fixable thing.
Like you said, the reality is that Democrats have moved well far left of where they were even during the Obama administration. It's kind of wild to me that so many Democrats view the Obama years as like a failure when they held office. I mean, there were many problems with the Obama administration, but he was still a two-term president. The first Black president was able to win a majority of the white vote. So obviously he did something right. And I think the reality is that Obama was a moderate, at least when he ran in 2008. He was willing to make a lot of cultural concessions on a lot of these cultural issues. You cannot do that anymore as a Democrat, right? Like, you have to be hard line on every single issue. Biden himself used to be pro-life, right? And now, like, that's unthinkable. Not only do you have to be pro-choice as a Democrat, you have to support getting rid of the Hyde Amendment. You have to support federal funding of abortion and making abortion free, and free lollipops and ice cream outside the abortion clinic or something, right? Like that's where the Democratic Party has gone. And I'm not trying to make this specifically about abortion, but I'm using that as an example of the reality is that both parties become very polarized on a lot of these issues that impact mainstream Americans. Now, going far left on social and cultural policy appeals to young people in the urban centers and urban cores. Those people dominate in the Democratic Party establishment. They also dominate in the media, which is why if you go on Twitter, I mean, you think that, most people were like 1 inch to the right of Karl Marx, right? Like that's how far left Twitter is. And that is kind of like driving a discourse in lots of the Democratic Party, social media, being liked by Hollywood, being liked by the people who write for the New York Times. All these people are on college campuses, of which they're only getting one message, and it's always like kind of like the most left-leaning progressive message. And that's all they have. And then they go into corporations, which have become increasingly more progressive, or they go into law schools, graduate programs, or they go into government many times. Around other people who've been inundated with that same messaging. And that's all since they're in that cocoon, and that's the only type of person that they've been exposed to for such long periods of time, it becomes like a sounding board, right? In which like there's no dissenting opinion allowed. The Democratic Party has become very much to the left of the median American, because the median American did not go to college. You got to remember that. So when you're constantly making policies and pushing talking points that appeal to college students, basically, or college grads, you're always going to be out of step with the median American. When you're talking about, should we refer to people of Latin descent as Latino or Latinx? that is an example of like when you have fallen off the deep end, right? Or when you're trying to call, pregnant women birthing people, or trying to make everyone use the word birthing people, or trying to police people on pronoun use and all this other stuff. None of this appeals to the median American, right? And that's not to say you can't care about women or you can't care about trans people or people of color. You can and you should, because those are Americans as well. But with that said, the constant pandering on these identity issues doesn't appeal to anyone. It doesn't appeal to minority groups or women. It's done to appeal to a very affluent, college-educated, and disproportionately white donor class who likes that sort of thing. I remember like there were so many polls during the presidential campaign that showed that most Americans, including most Black Americans, did not care what race the vice president was. We didn't care if Joe Biden chose a white person or a woman or a man or whoever to be the vice president. People just wanted someone that would be Trump. In other words, they just want the best candidate. Joe Biden put a restriction, I'm only going to choose a woman, right? No one asked for that. Who asked for that? Except for like the most radical people who probably write for like New York Times or once like Oberlin or something for college. So it's like the constant pandering of those people is just really off-putting. And I think that makes it really difficult. Joe Biden in the 90s version of Joe Biden would probably be a much stronger president than the 2022 version of Joe Biden, right? The Joe Biden that wasn't necessarily caught up in all the woke politics that really appeals to like maybe 5% of the population, that would be a Joe Biden that I think would be a very strong two-term American president, and quite frankly, maybe the president that we need. But what we have going on right now within the Democratic Party makes it really untenable. I grew up in a Democratic household, a Democratic family. A lot of my family, they may vote for Joe Biden, but they don't like Democrats at this point. And quite frankly, I don't really see what have the Democrats given to working class people without college educations to really have earned their vote. And that's really a shame because it's going to open up the door for other people. I think it's going to open up the door for Trump to run in 2024. And I think he has a decent chance of winning because the Democrats have alienated so many middle Americans.
Yeah, we've been picking on the Democrats. So let's talk about the Republicans for a minute. Because they've got a hot mess on their hands right now of what do you do with President Trump right now? Because he's not on the ballot for the midterms, but he's trying to make himself on the ballot for the midterms.
Yeah.
He's trying to set up for 2024, or at least fundraise like he's going to set up for 2024. But some of his picks in Georgia, the Senate race in North Carolina, a couple other places, he's done these early endorsements and they're not shaking out. You mentioned Glenn Youngkin earlier, so let's just use that because we've got raw data. We don't have to speculate on that one. He seemed to find the formula of not antagonizing Trump voters, but not really being able to keep some distance to Trump personally. Now, some of that was because Trump didn't really pay a lot of attention to that race. Let's just call it what it was. It's not like Georgia where he's personally invested or Florida where he's personally invested. So there might have been some of that, but is that scalable? Is that Youngkin model of running slightly more moderate, some of the Trump policies, but keeping Trump the man separate from it? Do you think that's scalable, or do you think that was a one-off? And of course, that works as long as the real Donald Trump doesn't show up. How much is he going to show up or not show up in this midterm? I think that's the question.
Yeah, I think that Glenn Youngkin did a masterful job, like you said, of kind of like riding kind of like that middle road of being Trumpy, but not too Trumpy. Not antagonizing the Trump voters, courting the Trump voters while also courting suburbanites at the same time. That's very difficult to do, but he managed to do it. And look, I think that in theory it's scalable, but I think it's also difficult, right? I think that not every place is Virginia. Virginia is a very specific sort of situation in which you have these hardcore, very right-wing Republicans, but then you also have in Northern Virginia a lot of families that work and live in DC, very cosmopolitan, very affluent. And that's a demographic that has, I guess, maybe in the early 2000s voted Republican, but has shifted to Democrats because Democrats have started courting more of that affluent suburban college grad demographic. That's a demographic that I think Republicans should court, but I think it's going to become much more difficult to when you take into consideration the fact that the Republicans also have been pushed to the right and much more radicalized in issues like abortion, much more radicalized on issues like race, right? Both sides have been radicalized on race, but just in different ways. Radicalized in LGBT rights, right? But moving towards a more regressive model of, for example, things like don't say gay bill in school, or the way you treat transgender youth, right? These are all complex issues. And I don't think either side is really in the right, personally. But I also think that when you take these very aggressive culture war stances, you're going to turn off people in the middle, and the people in the middle are typically suburbanites, right, and independent voters. So I think it's going to be really difficult for any Republican to be able to scale that up. And also, as you said, when Trump gets involved in the race, because I think we all know he's going to run in 2020, that's going to really make it difficult for, I think, any candidate. Because, like, do you really run against Trump, right? Is Trump beatable? I don't know. I mean, the Republican Party is a party where the supermajority of voters overwhelmingly believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And it's not even close. Probably like around 70 to 80% of them believe it at minimum. So at that point, like, if they believe Trump is the rightful president of the United States, is there anyone that can really, beat Trump, right? I think maybe Ron DeSantis. I think DeSantis is really good at mixing this sort of like competent technocrat type of identity while also leaning really heavily into the culture wars, which I think might be able to win enough suburbanites while also winning the Trump vote to be able to become a president of the United States, maybe. But, I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see how the 2024 GOP primaries shake up. But like, my prediction is that if Trump does run, you're going to see the field clear for him relatively quickly. Because, like, you may not losing against Trump isn't just losing, right? Like, you have also the real risk of being Jeb Bushed, to where, like, you just become completely irrelevant and you become a joke. And so do you want to blow out your political capital running against Trump in 2024 if you don't believe that he's beatable? It's a big risk. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the way I see it. I think the GOP is still the party of Trump, but him endorsing people isn't enough, right? I think for Trump, people go to Trump because he's Trump. Like, it's not like that thing where it's like, like a Netflix algorithm where it's like, well, if you like this show, you may like that show. Like, it's not like, oh, well, if you like Trump, you'll like Vernon Jones or whoever, right? Like, people like Trump for Trump. He's a very specific sort of entity. So, yeah, like I my opinion is that he's going to run again. I think he will win the GOP nomination. It's not guaranteed. But look, I still think he still has a firm grasp on that party.
Corey Walker, outstanding conversation. We got to leave it there. Let folks know where they can find you, your writing, your social media, what you have going on, and where they can follow you until we have you back on again, which we hope to do.
Yeah, you can follow me. My Twitter is at Corey Writing. My name is spelled Corey, and then writing is like the other part of the handle. Other social media, right now I'm a contributor at Reason Magazine, and also have written for Real Clear and The College Fix. So those are the places you can find me if you're interested.
Yeah, he's a great writer. He's got a piece out at Real Clear Energy on fracking in Russia that you should definitely check out. Look for him on Reason. Corey Walker, we'll have you back. We're going to be talking about these same things all year long, I suspect, and we'll touch back in with you soon, my friend. Thank you for the time.
Sure, 100%. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.